Hey, it's Cormac. Today on the feed, we're sharing an episode of our sister show Bite Back with Abbey Sharp, all about the shocking world of the red pill manosphere, which based on the news cycle feels very important and timely. I have to say, as a parent, this episode scared the hell out of me. But it's such an important conversation. What is the pipeline of the chronically online to incel culture? How is it linked to wellness culture? What are we as a society doing to teach anti-misogyny right out of the gate? Have a listen, and be sure to check out other episodes of Abby's podcast, Bite Back. We've left a link in the feed in today's show notes. Enjoy.
Welcome to another episode of Bite Back with Abbey Sharp, where I dismantle diet culture rules, call out the charlatans spinning the pseudoscience, and help you achieve food freedom for good. I am very excited about today's episode, as it is absolutely top of mind right now, following the release of the critically acclaimed Netflix series Adolescence. As a mom of two boys, I didn't just watch the show, I studied it in immense detail. And then, of course, I went down a rabbit hole of learning about the toxic manosphere and red pill community that the show brought to the forefront. My boys are just 7 and 4.5, so it really didn't occur to me that I needed to be thinking about like toxic masculinity and misogynistic violence quite this early. But apparently, I absolutely do. A recent investigation by Everyone's Invited listed nearly 1,700 primary schools where pupils as young as 5 submitted anonymous testimonies of rape culture. The report found that almost half of kids under 7 were already showing signs of misogynistic behavior. And as the show Adolescence explicitly calls out, a lot of these teachings are coming from social media influencers like Andrew Tate, Donovan Sharp, and Rollo Tomasi, who dominate the so-called manosphere, which is the umbrella network of male-focused movements characterized by extreme grievances towards feminism and its perceived threat to quote-unquote natural gender roles. A closely related subculture, quote-unquote red pillars, is used to describe a waking up to the supposed lies of society around modern gender dynamics to reclaim patriarchal gender roles. And finally, incels, or men who identify as involuntarily celibate, believe that they are destined to be rejected by women, leading them towards nihilism, deep resentment, and even misogynistic violence. When I watched Adolescence, which really highlights the dangers of these cultures, I knew that I absolutely had to speak to Dr. Emily Contois, who you might recall from my episode on gendered food choices. It's actually my most popular episode at Bite Back to date, so if you haven't already watched it, be sure to hit that up after this. But Emily is an associate professor at the University of Tulsa, specializing in how identities are formed at the vital intersection of food, the body, and ideas about health. She's also the author of Diners, Dudes, and Diets: How Gender and Power Collide in Food Media and Culture. Today we're going to be chatting about how the patriarchy harms young men, the dangerous teachings of the manosphere and how kids are even finding themselves there. We're also going to be going into detail on the intersection of diet culture and toxic masculinity, risk factors for our kids' susceptibility to these communities, and what parents can do now to get ahead of it. Also, a quick reminder that I would love if you would write me a little comment on this episode if you like it and leave me a 5-star review on the podcast. It really does help me get the word out. All right, let's get into it. Emily, thank you so much for joining me again. I have been literally so excited about this conversation all week. It is the highlight of my week.
That is so nice of you. I'm so honored to be back and glad that you asked me these questions. I think we can have a really important conversation today.
Totally. I'm very invested in this because, I have two boys and they're young and I'm trying to do, as much research I can, safely off social media because I'm just so scared the algorithm's going to start sending me Andrew Tate videos, which is not what I want to do. So that's why I'm hoping this can be like, a safe place for people to learn about this without going down that rabbit hole. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But to set the stage here, I feel like we just have to talk about the patriarchy. Because when people think about the patriarchy, they automatically think about all of the ways that, it disadvantages and oppresses women. But the patriarchy harms all of us, including men. And I'm wondering if you can talk a bit more about that.
Absolutely. So there's two pieces to how the patriarchy functions as a social system. One is that it privileges men over women. And so this is what we've been talking about, right? How women are universally, right, oppressed by this system. But it also privileges masculinity over femininity and only particular types of masculinity. So scholars will use, lots of different terms to talk about that. But when you think about how our culture defines a quote unquote real man, right now in our culture, that we're thinking about, individualism, strength, assertiveness, maybe even aggressiveness, right? Of going it on your own, taking risks, and these physical characteristics, right? Of being tall, being broad-chested, having big muscles, being really fit and active, that these are all ways, right, that a particular kind of masculinity is tied up in these ideas about patriarchy. And so in that way, it's a masculinity that hardly any men, right, like truly embody, right? Like some celebrities do, some actors do, some sports stars do, but the vast majority of men, right, are moving through the world in all different sorts of masculine types. And so that's the ways, right, that men can also feel trapped, right, in who they are, how they feel like they're living up to those expectations, and then where some of that chafing can be, right, where you feel like you're not living up to what it means to be a man.
Yes, that's so helpful because I think, I feel like a lot of women may feel that even just like acknowledging men's suffering in the patriarchy is like a betrayal of feminism. But like you're kind of describing here, like two things can be true. And again, we can recognize women's oppression and we can be empathetic to the pressures put on men to be the provider and to be fit and strong and to be emotionally stoic all the time, perform sexually and all those things that we expect, of masculinity. And when we look at the numbers, like men are in trouble too, right? Like men are more likely to drop out of school. They're more likely to be homeless. They're more likely to experience social isolation. They're 4 times more likely to commit suicide. So, acknowledging these struggles doesn't mean that we're like siding with the enemy here, right? We're really all on the same team.
Absolutely.
And in fact, I think if you were seeing it as like us versus them, young men are just going to be more, easily lured into these extremist communities like the manosphere.
No, absolutely. I think being able to have these conversations about what, true inclusion looks like, right? And how that's a project that involves all of us, of all of our different genders, all our different positions of social power, that we all have to be working towards that. So yes, as a feminist, you should absolutely, right, care about men, care about boys. I think some of the stuff that I found, so concerning as we've had, more and more conversations about masculinity, to have broad conversation about toxic masculinity, that has alienated a lot of boys, right? It's part of what has incited the kinds of backlashes that we see in the manosphere and incel communities and all of this. And so part of it is about how we did and didn't, right, engage a broad enough audience in those conversations. I think, how does this oppress women, but how is this also bad for men too? And how can we fight for the same solutions, right? They're going to benefit all of us.
Yeah. So helpful. Now, I briefly introduced some of these concepts off the top, but what are some of like the core tenets on like problematic teachings of these kind of manosphere communities?
So I see it mapping quite clearly off of patriarchy, right? Of like control, power, and authority over women and the expectation, right, that women are sort of meant to be subjugated. But then also this extreme sense of needing to control yourself. Yeah. Right? And that sometimes through discomfort or even pain, that is this pathway, right, to becoming this great, powerful man. And so some of that is in the mind, but a lot of it's also in the body. And so that can be sex, that can be fitness, that can be a number of different things. But those are 2 of the levels that we can definitely talk about how this messaging plays out.
Yeah. And when taken to kind of like an extreme level, like how do these misogynistic messages contribute to like normalizing violence against women? Like what does that sound like online? What does that look like in real life?
Yeah, I mean, I think foundationally to think that women are less than and should be, right? That they are less worthy, less smart, less, too emotional, too hormonal, right? Like all these, some of them come from sort of halfway science, some of them, are just sexist remarks. That when that's foundationally what you think about women, right, it lays the groundwork to treat them like objects, which we've seen in lots of media, lots of pornography, but also, right, to think that they need to be sort of kept in line. So two examples I could think of that were like a little bit broader that maybe people had heard about was thinking about like online trolling and how that behavior is very different, right, against women. So whether we think of something very coordinated and huge like Gamergate of, men in the manosphere who are also part of the gaming community being so upset, right, with women game developers, with more progressive storylines or characters being involved, of then attacking, right, directly these women online, doxing them, putting their home addresses online. But I can also speak from my own experience, right? Like I wrote an article once that was covered a lot by the right-wing press, and then a bunch of trolls came at me. And so they reinforce all these really sexist notions, right? That they were telling me to get back in the kitchen, to make them a sandwich, right? That my role, my, approved role as a woman was just to be in the home and to stay there. But also to use their language, I'm sorry, it's so profane, but right, like that I just needed to be properly, right? And then I wouldn't think these ideas, right? That my husband was milquetoast, right? So you see this really caustic language that only imagines women, right, in these positions of subjugation, not of power, not of intellect, not of authority, and really pushing back against that in really ugly ways, right? Like directly into your inbox, directly into your social media feed.
Oh yeah, people are so brave when they are behind that keyboard, are they not? Like it's outrageous. But it's not just behind a keyboard. Like I've heard and read articles about, young children chanting "your body, my choice" in to girls in the playground, which is not only like a mockery of like feminine discourse around body autonomy and consent, but it's basically like paints rape as a man's right, again, because of these like believed, gender expectations of like what women are good for and what men are, entitled to.
Yes. And I think part of it's, in the history of, the legal precedent of our country, right? It has not been that long for the law to really acknowledge women as autonomous figures, as people who can own property and get credit cards, and that rape can occur within a marriage, within a relationship, right? Like that's relatively recent in how the law understands women and our power within it. So this whole idea of a nostalgic idea of when America was great, a lot of it's based on these similar ideas, right, about what women's place was, as well as, right, queer people, people of color, disabled people, right, that all of us should just, go back.
Oh, God. Yeah. This conversation is more, it's quite relevant for various reasons.
Sadly, yeah.
But okay, so what is the pipeline for young boys, young men in accessing this content? Because I assume like most like 13, 14-year-old boys aren't searching like how to dominate women or like anti-feminism or things like that. Like how are they making their way to Andrew Tate?
Yeah. So I think there's two things. Like one is just the broader cultural discourse, right? That it is so disappointing, right? That a distinct anti-feminist backlash is mainstream and kind of everywhere. Right. And even if it's the news is covering something about Anthony Tate, right? Like it's not just this obscure social media content that you have to dig to find, like that this messaging is all over and is even being parroted, right, by, politicians in positions of authority and, speaking to the media every day. So that's one way, right? It's in the culture. And so, of course, that trickles down to our young people. They hear it from lots of different places. But the other thing that I found interesting research on is thinking about how things like Instagram and TikTok have brought about a lot of like lifestyle beauty concerns for both young men and young women. So for example, with young women, we see all these trends of, really young girls buying like anti-aging creams or spending lots and lots of money on beauty products, and, doing the same, makeup videos that have become, right, this whole category of content on these platforms. And then for men, there is this interesting complement, right, that goes along with this language of looks maxing, of this idea of, what exercises can you do to make your jaw look a particular way, right? Or, for women, we've heard, the high cheekbones, like it's a very similar kind of, negative beauty discourse that you're not enough, you don't look good enough, and here are the products that can help you. And it is relatively recent, right, for that kind of language and that sort of product push to go for young men. And so there was a really interesting study that looked at how men were looking at that kind of, young men looking at that kind of content on their social media feeds could very quickly end up in manosphere type content. So thinking about how the algorithms are constructed, the different ideas of, what the content is about, what's the underlying thread, and if you watch one, where do you go in the next, that there was this interesting thread that you could start out somewhere like there that is a little bit more innocuous, but still worrisome for us as we think about the self-esteem and understanding of young people, but that can make a jump to this kind of a space. So yeah, it's not a Google search term just like directly taking you there, but that was one very interesting pathway, that it can start from other sort of social media engagement. And I think one thing we skipped over too, that there's like the general manosphere, and then also this like sort of niche, right, of like incel, right, of like this involuntary celibate, of this belief, right, that like I am a man, and so I have a right to women's bodies, right? Women should want to date me, women should want to have sex with me. And so then when that doesn't happen, right, and there's this dissatisfaction, this partly physical, but we can guess, right, also emotional, right, to feel loved, to feel adored, to have, the specialness that's in a good relationship, like that there's an anger, right, and this big backlash to that not happening. And I think what's interesting is we see, because with women, we often see negative emotions, right, turned internally, right? Some of what we understand about eating disorders is that way. But with this manosphere incel culture, we see it both ways, right? That it's this anger at yourself, right? That like, I don't look good enough, I'm not muscular enough, right? Like I'm not the kind of man that my culture holds up, so women don't like me. I think, you hear the 80-20 rule, that like 80% of women want 20% of men who appeal more closely to those ideals. Like that's discourse you'll see in these spaces. Yes. So it's this anger, right, at your culture and at women, but also a dissatisfaction and a frustration with yourself. And so it's a very complex seeking of control in these two different directions, outward and inward.
Right. And there's so many subcultures. One that I've heard a bit about is this like gym cell subculture. Do you want to kind of talk about that?
Yes, this idea that your fitness regimen is uniquely tied to that idea, right? That I'm going to make myself more physically attractive and fit so to appeal. And they'll use almost like evolutionary language, right? To appeal the mate that I want, right? Like, it's very much going back to, the caveman lore that we also hear talked about, right? With the carnivore diet and, some of these other, ways of eating. That if we go back to trying to understand how humanity, used to be, and what's at our basis core that we should be adhering to, that your fitness regimen becomes understood, right, as a way to reshape yourself so that you can, right, go out like a caveman and get the cave woman who's supposed to live with you forever and do what you say.
Right. And again, talking about these, in many cases, unrealistic standards. I saw so many, I was reading, doing my research for this episode, I saw a glossary basically of really scary terms and phrases. And one was this like look, smack, or rope. You mentioned look, smaxing, I guess. It's so hard to say. But again, like this idea of like, doing all these like little things to like make your jaw super, chiseled and get you more muscular and X, Y, and Z. But this like look, smack, or rope is the suggestion that, you should improve your looks or basically unalive yourself, which at the very extreme level is, suggests that your appearance is your only measure of worth. Which again speaks to the kind of importance of body positivity for men too, which largely men have kind of been left out of that conversation for the most part. But we have lots of body positive role models for women, but what do men have?
Yeah, so I think this operates on two levels, right? Which like kind of goes back to the patriarchy thing, right?
Yeah.
When it comes to body positivity for men, there hasn't been a movement or something recognized sort of in the fashion space. Like I often think of, that great old Navy commercial with Amy Bryant, right? And there's like all these women and like all their different jeans and everyone's a different size. And it's just like such a fun, supportive, colorful, like high energy campaign. But there wasn't one for men, right? And like Old Navy has a whole half of the store for men. They sell pants for men, but like there wasn't, right, this complementary sort of messaging. And so I think there's two things. Like one is the fact that to be a man in a body that doesn't align with the ridiculous ideal, right, of having, gigantic arms and six-pack and all these muscular things, the sort of social sanctioning against that for men is less than it is for women. And so an example we can point to is like the whole dad bod phenomenon, right? That like he looks like he still works out, but he also looks like he eats a whole pizza, right?
Totally.
You're not chiseled, you're not lean, but that was considered like an attractive body, right? Like one women liked and one that was in the tabloids in a positive way. When like mom bod never existed, right? For for like women who've actually made life and grown it in their bodies and gained a little weight. And we never, right, look at that body and think it's good, right? It's immediately a body that's supposed to bounce back.
Change, yeah.
Go back to this ridiculous ideal.
Totally.
If you want to hear the rest of this conversation with Dr. Emily Contois, head over to Abbey's feed right now. And I highly recommend listening to her other episodes and follow the podcast for future episodes. That's all for today. Thanks for listening.